Hello again, everybody. If it's your first time with us today, welcome, and if you've been here before, welcome back. Today we're going to be continuing our Road to NM series. Join me as I'm embarking along my journey, my quest to try to reach the National Master title, touch that 2200 ELO rating. As we enter today, my ELO rating is at a level of 2008, so still a long way to go. 2008, got to get to 22, and this past weekend had the chance to play with the Jacksonville Chess Club, the Chess for Charity group at the Pablo Creek Library. If you're ever out in Jacksonville, they have events every Saturday. Be sure to come out, get some great chess in that way. And if you're looking to learn and you're in the area, on Wednesdays they also do some great teaching at the library as well. So be sure to check that out if you're interested. Now, during these games on this past Saturday, I got the chance to play four very young and very promising players, and what we're going to look at in these games is not only what did and didn't go right, what went wrong, what went well, but also thinking about the psychological aspects of chess. I want to be able to share with you guys, my own thought process, see if that helps you at all or helps you to relate to things that maybe you can avoid as well, see where I went wrong in my various games, because that happened in plenty of places. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive right in with round one. In round one on Saturday, I had the black pieces. I was playing a young scholastic player, Bhavi Chandra Hassan, and I do have to apologize to any of these players whose names I may or may not pronounce incorrectly throughout the making of my videos. Bhavi was playing white, and I had the chance to play a Budapest opening here with black, where after d4 and c4, black responds with knight f6 and the early e5, offering up a pawn in the center of a board. And soon we reached this position where black has just recaptured. There have been a trade of knights on the e5 square, and now it's white to move. So at the moment, if we look at what's going on in the game, things are relatively equal, relatively tame. Black has two pieces in the center. White, of course, has a queen in the middle of the board, which could be a target, but also controls a lot of squares right now, puts pressure on both of black's pieces. White also has two pawns, which are doing much more to fight for the center of the board than any of black's pawns are currently doing. So there's some dynamic equality going on within this position. But of course, drawbacks for white are his c1 bishop, which is blocked in by the e3 pawn, and then just the fact that black is very sound, has a very solid structure going on, and even the light square bishop is a little constricted by the pawn on c4. So with white's next move, he played the move knight to e4, and this is a slight inaccuracy, the reason being that in the Budapest, black often likes to develop the bishop to b4 with check, and if white plays knight c3, black will try to take that piece and double white's e-pawns. In this particular position, it has not happened yet, but white has now reinvited this idea by moving the knight off of the diagonal, and also the knight doesn't have anywhere in particular it's going to. I mean, yeah, it's creating a temporary attack on the bishop, but after bishop b4 check, where is the knight looking to go? It can't come to g5. It could go to g3, but I can't really argue that it's doing anything more on g3 than it was before on the c3 square. Meanwhile, after bishop b4, now white plays the move bishop d2. So the one positive of this idea for white is that, yes, the bishop on c1 was pretty bad. It was biting on the pawn on e3. So you could make the argument that after trading the bishops, you've gotten rid of your worst bishop. However, white now faces another problem, and that is if you take the bishop with the knight, that knight will have made three moves. You've gone knight c3, knight e4, just to bring the knight back to d2, where it could have gone in one move to begin with, and it isn't really accomplishing very much on d2 anyway. So taking with the knight on d2 isn't super happy looking. I mean, there's nothing wrong with it. It's sound. And the more important problem is if you take on d2 with the queen, which is what happens in the game, then there is a tactical threat here. Now, One thing to notice is I do overlook this tactical threat. This is something that I miss in the game, and white is okay for another few moves because of it. But why do I overlook this? So first of all, what is our tactical threat? The problem here is that when the queen moves back, now there are discoveries against white's knight. So the move knight takes c4 would win the pawn after bishop takes c4 and queen takes e4. Very nice tactic for black. So why do I overlook this tactic? Well, one thing that we get as chess players is we get tunnel vision. We start to look at things in a certain way. I see the weakness of the pawn on c4, but rather than looking for ways to exploit it with the queen, I'm thinking to myself, you know what? I want to develop my bishop to e6, put pressure on c4, and when white plays the move b3, that looks like a lever to me. So white defends with b3, and then I can play a5, a4, and try to rip open the a file for my rook to get into the game. I was already rather happy with my position as black because in the Budapest often you have to gambit a full pawn, and currently I've kept that pawn in a fairly solid position, so I'm usually happy in these sort of areas. And because of that, I relaxed a little bit. I didn't look for these sharp tactics. So you always want to make sure you keep that killer instinct in chess. Just because you're happy with how things look now doesn't mean there's not something sharper, something better that you can be pouncing on. I played the move d6, overlooking our tactic on c4, and white played bishop d3, which once again allows the same idea. Again, we can play knight c4, bishop takes, and queen takes. But going back to that idea we mentioned before, chess blindness, right? Not having that full killer instinct. And in round one, I hadn't quite kicked that into gear yet. I was thinking positionally, thinking soundly, and I went with my blinders. I played bishop e6, piling on this way, and white played b3. And now, even though I had already talked about the idea of a5 and a4, I thought to myself, you know what? I'm just going to go ahead and create some imbalance. I'm going to capture his bishop and create a bishop versus knight situation in which I'm going to look to show that my bishop will be better than the knight. I also thought, you know, this looks like it's going to be great because after the queen takes, I can play the move bishop f5, right? Wrong. Bishop f5 does not work in this position. And why is that? White has a very nice tactical threat, and that is knight takes d6 with check. And of course, this is forking the king and the bishop. We have to retake the knight. Queen takes d6, and after queen takes d6, now we have queen takes f5, and black is suddenly the one who's down a pawn. True, we can play queen to b4 check and make the king move to f1, have white lose the right to castle, but not so sure that the full pawn is fully compensated for. So bishop f5 does not work yet, and I had seen bishop f5 when I'd played bishop, well, when I captured the bishop on d3, but I didn't really calculate much further than that. I said, that looks like it's going to be good. Surely it can't be bad. And then I started to actually think, you know, that's not going to be too hot. So maybe taking the bishop right away isn't so good for black either. Playing a little bit too hastily. So always slow yourselves down. Make sure that your plans are actually in line with where you want to go in the longer run, not just something that you see and go, this is going to be good. It's going to get me something quick and easy. So I castled. White castled, and unfortunately, this is the losing mistake for white. Why is castling going to lose the game? Well, the same idea we already mentioned. Black wants to play the move bishop to f5, create the pin, and after this happens, white plays f3, only way to defend, and black is going to be able to destroy the pawn structure of white and very easily pile up on the e-file. Once again, chess blinders, I already saw that after the takes and the captures on the e-file, these pawns would be nifty targets. I can play rook e8, I can play rook e5, I can double. If he defends, the only way is to bring his rooks to d5 or d4 and f4. I can kick this rook on f4 off of the file with the moves g5 and h5. So eventually I'm going to be able to win that pawn. There's no way for white to stop that. That's all going to be forced. However, better than going that right away, rook e8. The knight's still pinned, so go ahead, pile on it while you can, and then your rook is that much closer to the action. I got eager again, got those chess blinders on. I played the move bishop takes e4. And of course, it's not bad for black. After queen e4, and fe4, exactly what we mentioned is what happened in the game. We brought our rooks in, defended, looked to double up. White tried to defend, but all of this is completely forcing that we mentioned. And now that the rook has gone back to g3, do we take the pawn right away? One more little move first, and that's f6, making sure we're defending our g5 pawn, and still white cannot get to the defense of e4 in any sort of time. So this is going to be a winning endgame for black. We'll look over it fairly quickly, but not go into too much detail. Basically, white's going to try to create a little threat. We defend. h4, an enterprising move, but it does not actually have any real threat because we can always just take back on g5 with our f-pawn. So takes the pawn, trades a pair of rooks, trades a pair of pawns, and king to f2. So how does black go about winning these sort of positions? Well, first of all, we're going to need to create an outside passer with the h-pawn. That's step number 1. And then step number 2, we're going to keep pressure on the e-file with our rook to keep white's pieces tied down to defense. And if we can trade off these rooks, then we're going to be in a winning king and pawn endgame, because that outside passer will force the white king to go over to defend it, and then black can walk his king around, gobble up all of white's pawns, and win a happy endgame. King g6 is a slight inaccuracy. This does allow for rook to f8. My whole point was that I'll be able to defend these pawns if he attacks them from behind. But it would have been better to play my next move. It would have been better to play rook e7 right away and just threaten rook f7 back when the rook was on f3. So another small inaccuracy. Again, trying to go forward too quickly. A common theme that you see in my first 2 games. Seeing an idea and jumping on it rather than looking for better. Rook to h8 and h4 was played. And now after rook to f8, another slight inaccuracy from white because we can trade off rooks and enter that winning king and pawn endgame. King will defend, lock up white from being able to push forward, trade off this pawn here, creating the outside passer. And now, after king e5, you see black has the outside pawn, and so he's going to be able to capture and create a passer at will. King to g4, trade comes, and then here comes the pawns. Going to start creating our pass pawn with moves like d5, b5, and c4. Takes, king comes up. And now we're just making that fairly straightforward game. Now that this king's running forward, what do? A nice instructional moment for those of us who are learning endgames starting out here. This is called keeping that king away. We want to take the opposition, shouldering the king, blocking the squares so that the king cannot run back in front of the pawn. King f3, shoulder him again, king d2. And after king f2, now we played the move c3. You can, of course, shoulder the king one more time with king d2, but the point here is that after king e1, c2 also gets control of the d1 square, and white cannot stop the queen. So in this position, my opponent resigned. Well, let's go ahead and move on to the second game. We saw the first game a long struggle, endgame struggle for the most part, and once again we got another endgame fairly quickly out of the opening in our second game. So in game 2, I played young Ryan Ratliff. I had the white pieces, and this position came out of a king's gambit. We went to an endgame rather quickly, and both of us are players who rather enjoy the ending. And we'll see kind of another one of our themes, white, and what I chose to do was to push a little too hard. I tried to create imbalance where imbalance did not yet need to be created. I tried to force the position, and as a result, you'll see that black gets a very nice position, even a winning advantage at one point, and only barely misses his chance to convert. So what happens in this game? Well, it looks like white should be playing natural moves. King e2, rook to g1, centralize the other rook, maybe even juggle on the g file, and just play natural moves, look for ways to improve the pieces. But what did I do? No, I said if I want to win a game, I need to create an imbalance, right? I need to create something that is different in my position than his. and I played bishop g5. Inherently, this isn't a losing move. It's not anything that's going to throw my game away. But my thought is I'm going to trade my bishop for his knight and then find a way to prove that this knight is better than the black bishop. The problem with this is that if you're going to show this, the structures already need to naturally come about in which one piece or not is better than another, and then you try to show why that is. But if you go very early on, if you just seek to trade off and create an imbalance and then try to force your will upon your opponent, usually your opponent has enough flexibility. There's enough options left for them to counter exactly what you're doing. And sometimes you can get those blinders on, get so drawn into your own idea that you totally miss the weaknesses you create in your position. And this is exactly what happens in this game. So after h6, bishop takes knight, and bishop takes e7, I played the move d5. So my whole idea here is I want to control the light squares. I want to make black place their pawns on the dark squares. I want to constrict the bishop with moves like h4 and lock this black bishop backwards in the game and prove that my knight is better. That sounds wonderful on the surface, right? That sounds like a great idea. Okay, and why not? If you can make that happen, that sounds like a good way to go. Well, the problem is after e5, we're already starting to create our own little weaknesses. Weakness number 1, the f3 pawn. True, black's bishop is a little constricted, but this is a target. So h4, trying to keep the bishop from coming to g5 and into the game, and black plays his rook to f8, naturally attacking my weakness. We defend with king e2, and now g5, a very big move, and a very important one. The problem with g5 for white is that, of course, if you take bishop takes g5 allows the bishop into the game, which totally busts your whole strategy of playing against the bishop. We don't want to do that. But after h5, now white has created weakness number 2. The f3 pawn and the h5 pawn both will become permanent, fixed, long-term targets for black. And black has the perfect squares to go to attack it. He can plop a rook on f4, and if this rook ever leaves the h-file, that rook's coming to h4. Even if this rook doesn't leave the h-file, the rook might come to h4 and threaten to take the pawn in some lines, especially if the other rook gets traded off. So these are all going to be long-term problems for white. And I got so fixated on this idea of let's control the light squares, let's put our pieces there. I want to move my knight and bring it to like f5, something like this. And yeah, if I could put that knight on f5 right away, that would probably be okay. If I could magically play knight f5 instantly, then we wouldn't have to worry so much about the weakness of the f3 pawn. But the problem is that I did not have enough time, and I didn't really take the effort to calculate all the way to there. I saw that strategy and said, it'll get there. Concretely, it never does. And let's see how black takes advantage of that. Rook f4, natural move, plopping into the hole we created. And now, rook g1. Again, it would be better if white could immediately go knight d1 to e3 to f5, but the problem is that I'm still hung up on locking down the light squares. And if black plays the move g4, then the bishop will once again be able to come into the game via g5, and that's not really proving that my knight is any better. Still, that may have been better than what I did. It might have been better to simply go for that and allow a g4 break. Though once the knight moves, g4 also undermines the e4 square, so if f takes g4, then the rook can take on e4, and you have a protected pass pawn. All sorts of issues for white going on in this position. Rook h to f8, naturally piling on, and now rook h3 to defend, and this is an ugly-looking rook, very passively placed, and a very nice idea from my opponent. And this really is the straw that starts to show all of the cracks in white's plans. Why does black play bishop d8? See if you can come up with black's idea here. See what my young opponent came up with in order to bring this bishop back into the game. Why are we moving it back to d8? Well, I need to get my knight into the game, so I played knight d1. And of course, c6. Now the bishop will come into the game via the b6 square, and white can do nothing to stop this. And if white brings his knight to e3 immediately, bishop b6 also pins it to the g1 rook, so I can't even bring my knight to f5 in time before black will be able to trade it on the e3 square. If black manages to trade his bishop for my knight, well, then we're just in this rook endgame where, guess what? White has all the weaknesses. So this is not looking good for the white pieces at all. c4 attempts to keep a little bit of structural soundness in the center. So c takes d, and bishop b6. We've already talked about how knight e3 sounds ugly. If I play knight e3, then bishop takes, king takes, and we're going to have to defend this endgame. But the truth is, this is white's best shot. White has to just accept that, you know what, this is going to be a tough ending to hold, but this is what I need to do. That would be the best course of action, because at least you've still got two rooks. At least you might be able to bring this one here with check. Maybe you can create some counterplay somewhere. If this rook ever comes out of f4, you might be able to get this rook into the game. Hard to say. Maybe you'll be able to put this rook on g4 if you get the chance. And, you know, some chances to unwind. But not great. Not happy. Not what you want for white. The problem is I was still so hung up on the idea that I can prove that my knight is better than this bishop. Sometimes you have to accept a slightly worse position and just try to defend it with all your might. Instead, I played rook g2. And now black plays king d7, preparing to bring the other rook into the game. And knight c3 now. I'm trying not to let black trade off this knight if I can't help it. But after black's next move, bishop d4, it becomes evident that there's nothing white can do. If black wants to trade this knight off, he can. If the knight comes to b5, it can just be kicked. If the knight goes back to d1, it looks like you've just wasted a move. And if the knight comes to a4, it's completely dominated by the bishop. This is very, very ugly. And here, I came up with an idea to try to unwind a little bit, and I got very lucky that my opponent let me play it out, is essentially what happens. So rook g to g3, putting two defenders on this pawn. That way my king can potentially move away and help in the defense against the king side. And my opponent played a6. So my opponent did not take the knight, and this was my first glimmer of hope in this game. Being completely tied down, really feeling rather crushed positionally. I was not very happy at all, and when I saw my opponent play a6, I got a faint glimmer of maybe they don't want to take my knight. And if they don't want to take my knight, then I will happily find a way to make it better. King e1 is another mistake and a losing one. For the same reasons we've talked about, black should capture this knight and then seek to target all of white's many, many weaknesses. There will now be 4 of them in the position after bishop takes c3. King to d2 would have been better, because then you can recapture with the king and at least not allow for a disgusting c-pawn. And I caught my one break of the game, my biggest lucky break of the game, with the move b5. Unfortunately, now things start to shift the other way. So where I had the tunnel vision earlier in the game, now it's my opponent whose tunnel vision comes back to haunt them a little bit with a6 and b5, preparing moves like b4. And the problem is, over the next few moves, black is going to allow white to escape from the bind. So knight e2, of course, forks the rook and the bishop. And rook f7 is the second mistake. Why do you say that? Now you think my rook's under attack, and rooks are worth more than knights, so I should move it away, right? Well, the problem is that black has stronger. And if white takes this knight, or takes this rook rather, black's still going to have a very nice position. He can recapture. His bishop has a lot of pressure. His rook has a lot of pressure. And there's still weaknesses. There's still things that are being attacked all over the board. What I really like for black here is the move g4. g4 attacks the h3 rook, so white has to worry about this right away. And if knight takes f4, trying to defend the rook at the same time, then e takes f4, and both of white's rooks come under attack. It's true you can play the move rook takes over here, and maybe white is able to get out of it a little bit in this way. But after bishop takes b2, we're still going to be able to retreat the bishop here, have a 2-on-1 on the king side. So pretty good counterplay for black there. If not g4, you can also consider bishop takes b2, where after knight takes, you can play e takes, have a 3-2 queenside majority, a 2-1 kingside majority, and a very powerful bishop that's supported by the pawns on the dark squares. This looks even better to me than the g4 idea, actually. And black is still pressing in this game. White is going to have to come up with some good defensive ideas, even up in exchange. So rook to f7, unfortunately, allows white to simply trade off and play king d2, planning to come up and win the pawn. Now white does have to worry about how to untangle these rooks. Black isn't busted yet. It's still a long defensive battle ahead, but the next move unfortunately gives it all away. Black plays the move g4. And why is g4 losing? Well, as we mentioned before, when the pawn is on g5, this f3 pawn is totally tied down. It's completely constricted. It cannot push forward. These rooks are both tied down to the defense, and this means that white's position is passive. After g4, white can come to life, and in a huge way. After rook takes g4, it's true you can counterpunch with the move rook takes f3, but now weaknesses are even on both sides. In fact, now black has more weaknesses. Look, white has 3 over here potentially, and black has 4. So suddenly things have totally changed. There's more weaknesses on the black side than the white side. Furthermore, when these pawns back here on the 6th rank fall, white's pawns are going to be closer to queening than black's pawns will. These things don't add up for a good-looking race for black. This isn't the position they want to be going for. And we're going to see very quickly how this endgame is winning for white. So after the trade of rooks, rook takes f3, rook takes, we get rook g7 check, force the king back, and then the rook comes to g6 and forks both pawns. Something's going to have to give, so black has to choose between a passive defense or an aggressive one. Almost always the aggressive defense is the more active, better way to go in chess. However, it just doesn't work here. So after rook f2, king up, rook takes, and rook takes. The problem is that white has passed pawns not only in the center, but also on the h-file, so the king is not going to be able to stop both of those areas. White's king is going to be able to gobble up the d4 pawn and find a safe home on the e5 square, and white's rook is going to be behind black's passed pawns, whereas black's rook is currently in front of them. All of these things add up to a winning advantage for white. Rooks belong behind the pawns, not in front of them. You have one extra passer and the king's safety. This is just going to be too much for black to deal with. So we'll go ahead and look through the last few moves here. b4, rook comes to b6 and a5. The main point of this is not so much that you're going to win the pawn right away, but you do want to keep an eye on the pawns, of course, and you're also freeing up the h6 pawn. So after a5, here goes your h pawn. Black plays rook to h2 to stop that from running up the board, and now the king gobbles up the d4 pawn. And black here decides to play the move b3. Hard to argue. At this point, white is simply going to walk up the board and create mating threats, or white is going to play the move rook b5 and then gobble up your pawns anyway and then do that. Either one is going to work out just fine, so black tries to take it on himself with one last effort here, saying, hey, I'm going to play b3, and after you take and I take, now I'll be able to get my rook behind my a-pawn and push it, right? Well, not quite. So after rook takes and rook takes, how does white put their rook in the proper place? How does white win the game on the spot here and really tie things up? Rook to b8 check. A key endgame piece to remember when you can play these rook moves with check in order to get behind the pawn, maneuver to the other side of it. So after the king move, rook a7, and now black cannot hold on to the a5 pawn, and the game will be over. Black played rook b6, rook takes a5, and we did play down several more moves, but at this point it's clear that white is going to be able to slowly push the king back, move these pawns forward, create mating threats, and either checkmate or create a queen. So round 2, very tough, very lucky to escape with that. And one thing you'll notice, I mean, both of these analyses of games I ran through on our chess.com site, and on chess.com they give you a score, right, between 0 and 100 of how well you're doing. And if we look at the reports and the scores that they give in each of these two games, the accuracy scores, it had mine at 95.6 and my opponent was 87.3. That is a very high accuracy for someone who is just around an 1100 rating. I've played tons of games on chess.com, and running scores from the last tournament I played, those accuracy scores of two of my opponents who were rated 1800, 1850, those guys were getting about 85% accuracy. So both Ryan and Bavi in the previous game had accuracy scores of 85 in that area and higher. So for 1,100 players to be playing at this caliber is also a real testament to their strength in deciding to show up and play. Well, we survived round 2, and that left us with 2 rounds to go. We're going to go a little bit quicker through these rounds, and they won't take quite as long either. And, well, this is where I really gave myself a kick in the pants, and I decided to get my killer instinct back, and we're going to see how these 2 rounds played out that much quicker as a result. Now, my opponent was Brooks Chandler in this game. I had the black pieces again. Brooks had the white. And after round 2's near disaster, I really decided to just lock in, buckle down, and look for whatever I could to try to play some fun, exciting chess and show that killer instinct. Look, not miss these tactical shots that I had in my previous couple games. And in this opening, you'll see that white has played his bishop out to f4, which is common in a London system, for example, which is kind of how the game began. But then white has also played the move c4. So we're sort of mixing systems a little bit. We're in a queen pawns opening. Nothing inherently wrong at this point, but some of the main ideas that white has to look out for are black wants to make some trades here on d4 and create an isolated pawn position, play against white's isolated pawn. And also, white can't necessarily make the same trades because if c takes d4, knight takes d4 creates some attacks on the bishop, and this can be bothersome. And unfortunately, this is exactly what happens. My opponent plays c takes d4, and it seeks to resolve the center too early. And after knight takes d4, this attack on the bishop is just a real pain in white's neck. If he doesn't want to give up the bishop pair, he has to play bishop g3, which is what happens. And now that loss of a tempo allows black to take over on the initiative. After c takes d4, white has to choose whether to take with the knight or take with the pawn. If white captures with the knight, then black can play bishop b4, where white has to decide where to put his knight, and either way doesn't look good because knight c3 will lose a pawn, and perhaps even an exchange, because now we're checking and winning the rook. So that's not going to be any good for black at all. Go back forward here a few moves. But of course, if white takes with the knight here, and we play bishop b4 check, if he plays knight d2 instead of knight to c3, well, now we can take this knight and create the isolated pawn position, and this knight on d2 looks awkward. Potentially, black can play a move like queen a5, pile on. This doesn't look very happy or comfortable at all for the white pieces. So, white went ahead and made the decision to play pawn takes on e4. And now black is looking for ways to take advantage of this. You see there's a lot of holes in the white position. This file is very open, and b2 is unprotected because the bishop has come out and over to g3. So black plays the move queen to b6. This is a very dangerous move because of the pressure it puts on b3, and white really only has one good move to defend here. If you are seeing this position for the first time, great place to pause, take a look at it, and see if you can figure out how can white defend this position. How can he keep the defense of the d4 square and the b2 square? Well, what white needs to play here is queen to d2. And this looks incredibly awkward. It screams that maybe something has gone wrong in white's plan, but in this position it works. The queen defends b2, and if black plays the move bishop to b4, then knight to c3, and the queen, even though it seems it's overloaded, even though it looks like something has to give, it is able to defend b2, c3, and d4 against all of the black threats, and this holds perfectly fine and soundly, but a very uncomfortable move to play, queen d2. A much more natural looking move to play, and what my opponent played was b3, and unfortunately this creates too many dark square weaknesses. How do we pounce on the squares around the king now that b3 has lessened control? Bishop b4 check. And the problem is you can't play knight c3 anymore, so the knight has to come to d2, and now the knight blocks the queen's defense of d4. Knight takes d4, wins a pawn, and still keeps all of this pressure going against the white pieces. White played bishop c4, trying to create a square to castle with the king and trying to relieve some pressure with maybe bishop takes d5. Knight takes f3 with check, and now white cannot recapture with the knight because of the pin. And if white recaptures with the queen, bishop takes d2 will draw the king out into the open, so white doesn't really want to do that either. But g takes f3 is perhaps even worse. Queen takes f3 may have had to be played here. And the problem is that after g takes f3, black has the crushing blow, queen to d4. Now we're putting pressure on the rook. We're doubling down against the pinned knight. The king cannot castle or else the knight will fall. So everything is tied down in the white position. The white bishop can't come back to defend because the knight covers those squares as well as the queen. White probably should play a move like bishop takes d5 here, because if queen takes d5, at least the bishop can come back to f4 and help out. And if pawn takes e4, maybe you can play queen e2 check. But bishop d6 would be fine to block in that situation. The one thing that queen d4 does open up, though it's a little bit of a trap, is this move bishop b5. It looks like, bishop b5, right? I'm going to throw in a check, and after bishop d7 takes and takes, now black's king is stuck in the middle. Problem is black doesn't care. White has no way to take advantage of the black king in the middle at this point. He's too tied down to the defense of the knight. And after the move rook c1, trying to bring the rook into the game, rook a c8 simply shows that, hey, your rook doesn't matter because I've got two that can take over the file just as easily. And in this position, white resigned the game. And why is that? Well, there's just too many threats. If it's black to move here, I mean, let's say that white plays something, just h4, for example, if it were black's move still. Black can go right ahead and play queen takes d2 check. And after queen takes d2 check, there's the crushing move rook takes c1 check, because the bishop pins the queen to the king. And after the king comes up, you can play bishop takes queen check, now defending the rook and still attacking the other. So if the king takes the bishop, you take the other rook, and after rook takes rook, bishop takes, you're up two pieces and a pawn, a rook and a knight and a pawn. This is just not going to be happy for white. And additionally, black can even consider moves like maybe knight c3 here, if the queen comes to c2, and knight e4. And now everything's attacking the knight. The rook is discovering an attack on the queen. And if you play pawn takes over here, then we'll take the queen. If you play queen takes on the e-file, then we can play the move queen takes d2, and after the king moves, then rook takes over here. Either way, white's position is going to be falling apart. Black is going to win big material and the game. There's simply no way to respond to all of these threats, and unfortunately white had to resign. So this was a good example of getting that mental state back, though, right? So looking for those ways to take advantage, getting those pieces back in. Even when you've got those bad games, stay hungry for more and looking to win. And round 4 is going to be one more example of that. And round 4 occurred very, very quickly. My opponent, I can tell, had studied this opening before. We both blitzed out our moves in about 15 seconds until we got to this point. I mean, we spent next to no time. This came out of an accelerated Sicilian dragon. And up to this point, everything has been mainline. She had the opening memorized. So, kudos to her for there. Here, black played their first inaccuracy. And that's the move a6. Now, why is a6 an inaccuracy? Well, the problem is that a6 happens in a lot of Sicilian positions, taking control of b5 and preparing a b5 push. But in the dragon, it's important for black to get castled quickly, to seek to maybe play d5 if they can, put the pawn on d6 usually, get the bishop developed, and you want to make sure you're getting counterplay on the c-file. This is the fastest way to get your counterplay going in the dragon. White kind of has two different ideas. In this line, I've played bishop c4 with my last move, which seeks to stop black's d5 ideas. If we go back 2 moves before I play bishop c4, the main 2 moves here are bishop c4 or f3. If white plays f3, black gets the chance to play this d5 break. And this sort of frees up black's position a little bit. So bishop c4 is a line which seeks to stop that. And in order to work against this, black should look at moves like queen to c7, lining up with the bishop. And after the bishop comes back to b3, black can play things like d6, bishop d7, rook to c8, castles kingside, and then potentially maybe start putting pawns down this side of the board. Also maybe play knight to e5 to c4. After moves like queen d2, this forks the bishop and the queen, forces off trades on the c4 square, and black is able to get some very quick play on the queen side. Everything in the Sicilian becomes very sharp, very quick. And a6 in this position is actually a slow move. Even though it looks like it's preparing b5, it's actually a slow move because it's not taking control of the c-file quick enough. Furthermore, one of the problems with a5 is that you've loosened some dark squares over on this side. And I did not take advantage of this right away. I also had my mainline blinders on. I knew that bishop b3 was the mainline move after queen c7, and I kind of played it blindly. I played bishop b3 here right away, said, it can't be bad, it's prophylactic against the move b5. But this also misses a chance for white, and what chance does white overlook here? What can white play to take advantage of this a6 move? What white can actually play here is knight takes c6, and this may seem counterintuitive because b takes c6 looks like it's moving toward the center to allow black to be able to make their d5 push. But the problem is the c-file has closed off here, so black loses the ability to get counterplay on the c-file, which in turn makes the c4 bishop's presence a little bit stronger. It's more justified there. Also, it's harder for the bishop to develop into the game because the pawn is on a6, and a6 is now a target and a weakness that can't be defended by a pawn, so white potentially can look to play maybe even moves like queen e2, maybe knight a4, maybe knight b6. All of these squares have become gaping holes in black's position that white can look to take advantage of, maybe even knight a4 right away, aiming for this hole. Could be possible. Of course, e4 is hanging in this position. But knight takes c6 would have been a nice way to take advantage of the a6 push. I played bishop b3 instead, a more mainline move, castles, f3, and now e6. And this was the first move that rang alarm bells for me. Even though a6 isn't the most precise move in the accelerated dragon, e6 for sure is not the proper one. Your bishop's not getting into the game. You're not bringing anything onto the c file yet. And now, not only are these squares holes, but all of these dark squares are asking for some trouble. How did we say we could have taken advantage of this before? Well, same way we're going to again this time. Knight takes c6. And the point is, if you play b takes c6 now, bishop to c5 is going to occupy the d6 square right away. If you play d6, it's going to fall to queen takes d6. And if you play the move rook to e8, then bishop d6 is positionally crushing, tying down black's position all around. The rook can't come here. The rook can't go back. The knight can't drop back because the rook's on that square. Queen's going to have to come out in order to free up space for the rook, to free up space for the knight. And this is an absolute mess for black to have to try to untangle. White's going to try to centralize his queen, get more control of the dark squares, bring his knight into these squares as well, play moves like a4, a5, maybe even c4. This is going to be very, very bad. My opponent didn't take with the b-pawn. She did take with the d-pawn. And now a slight inaccuracy again. We should be taking advantage of the dark squares here. What white should just do is go ahead and trade queens, and then play the move bishop b6. But I played bishop c5, kind of hung up on the b takes idea. But the point just being, you're going to have to move your rook now, and after you move your rook, then I'm still going to have control over everything, and things are going to look pretty nice. Well, black played rook e8, which falls into white's plan, but there is a very nice move for black here, a very counterintuitive move, and that would be the move b5. b5 frees up this position, because now if white plays queen takes and rook takes, of course you're not winning the exchange, and you can't really play rook b6 or bishop b6 rather and tie anything down. Black's already achieved b5, so his rooks are going to be fine. He's going to be able to activate and get them into the game. So white should try bishop takes f8, but now queen takes f8 leads to a very interesting position. Even though white has won the exchange, black is doing a wonderful job of completely cutting off this knight and this bishop. I mean, what are these pieces doing? They're eyeing a bunch of dead squares, so white's going to have to find a way to reroute this knight into the game. Black has ways to develop his bishop, put it on b7, play moves like c5, threaten c4, bring his rook to the d file. This bishop's on a beautiful diagonal. All in all, I think black has great compensation for the exchange in this position. So bishop to c5 is definitely an accuracy because it allows this idea that I completely overlooked with pawn push to b5. Black played rook to e8, which basically allowed for queen takes queen, rook takes queen, and bishop b6, all of which could have been played one move before by white and avoided black's potential for b5. So once again, these mental small little inaccuracies and small blocks. You know, you play one good move and you see the positional pluses and then you follow it up incorrectly and you lose them. So you got to keep that killer instinct to convert these sort of things. Unfortunately, my opponent made a very deadly mistake in this position. It's very tough because where do you put this rook? If you put the rook on f8, it's just in the way, it seems like. It seems you want to put it on the d file, but d1 is covered, d2 is covered by the king, d3 is covered by the pawn, d4 is covered by the bishop, d5 is covered 3 times, d6. Okay, d6 is open, but why don't we want to go to d6? Well, we'll see that pretty soon why we don't want to do that. So that basically only leaves rook d7, which then would block your bishop from developing and just leaves you in a completely, utterly ugly passive position. Black's best here would be rook e8. and then try to get this bishop out and try to untangle some way this way, but it's still a real mess, and white has some great positional pluses. Unfortunately, black played the move rook d6, and why does rook d6 lose on the spot? e5, forking the knight and the rook. And white is going to not only win a piece, but still have all of their positional advantages and continue to add to the pressure in this game. And we won't look through the rest of the moves too much here. This is a great place to wrap things up for now. White wins the piece and will go on to win the game. But the moral of the story is throughout these tournaments, you've got your ups and your downs, right? So you've got all sorts of things going on, and you can never take any of your opponents lightly. So even if you're the higher rated guy, even if you're coming out here, everybody's got a chance to play a great game against you. Anybody on any given day can take you down a notch. And you got to stay humble, got to stay hungry. I was lucky enough to escape without dropping any rating points in this day. I went from 2007 at the start of the day to 2008 at the end. And, now we're just going to keep on moving toward the next goals, next days. And I hope you've enjoyed these videos, hopefully learned something as well. Be sure to leave any questions, comments you have in the sections below, like, share, all of those fun things. And I hope that you're able to take this and have some great chess in your games to come. So best of luck to you, and looking forward to seeing you in the future.